All right. My name is Justin Sider. I am the Chief Information Officer at Belay Technologies. I really just write PowerShell all day. It's kind of a nice job. So today I'm going to talk to you about PowerCLI Lint. It's really just PowerShell Lint in general, but specifically try to address any PowerCLI issues you guys have. And it's really just about writing better reusable code. So we'll jump right into it. All right. So again, easy to read, reusable code. You want to be able to pass your code off to somebody. You don't want to have to come back to it 6 months later and go, holy crap, why would I ever do that, right? So we're going to take a look at some of the tools that are out there that are kind of the PowerShell standard and run you through how to use those and what it's going to look like. I don't have any fancy things dropping in, so some of the slides get kind of busy. I'm sorry. It'll be up and available after the talk, so you can kind of take a closer look at it if it doesn't look good tonight. All right. So linting, it sounds really gross, and it can be if it's really old code. But you're really looking for styling issues, right? So you have consistent style, people can read your code, violations of any of the best practices. There's a link there for the PowerShell unofficial guide. That's really kind of the official guide that everybody uses. Comment-based help exists, so that way, when you write a function or you're writing code, people can use get help and determine, how they're supposed to use your code. And then the last one would be code complexity. And this is going to be for nested ifs and really complex code and trying to break that up so that you really have smaller pieces of code. And that way when you go back to refactor, you go back to add a feature, it's quick and easy. It's not a painful process. All right. So one of the things when you come to PowerShell is you have this idea of this one-liner, and you want to do this really long, elegant one-liner that just kind of takes care of everything in the world. And it sounds great, and it's really cool to do some competition with the guy next to you, but as far as the longevity of the code, it's not a good practice. So when you have more lines, it's easier to read, it's easier to fix. And a couple little things here. The null is on the top line. The null is on the wrong side of the equation there, or the equality comparison. So I hate this rule because to me, when I'm trying to compare something, I always see if it's equal to null, not if null is equal to something. It seems really backwards in my mind, but apparently that's the standard. Additionally, they say not to use write host. That's my go-to. I think I've finally convinced myself that write output is okay, but I feel like that should be writing it to a file, not back to the console. So try to use write output, because then you don't have to do a find and replace when you actually go to save your code. All right. So using the percent sign is probably something that you guys potentially use, and that's an alias, and they frown against aliases. So it's perfectly correct, right? There's nothing wrong with it. But when you go to use Script Analyzer, it's going to yell at you and tell you that you can't use a percent sign. If you're using VS Code, there's a PowerShell plugin, and if you have the PS Script Analyzer module installed in your box, it'll highlight all these things for you. So you don't have to wait to run Script Analyzer after you've saved the code. You can just do it all while you're coding. You'll see things highlighted. So you can see that by the little green underline there. So you know that you can go in and change those things. I fixed it on the next line, and there's no little green squiggly. All right, comment-based help. This is, when you do get help on any kind of function, this is what comment-based help is. It's actually super simple to set up. There's all kinds of documentation out there on PowerShell on how to do this. The minimum things are that you have a description. You're going to want to include an example, any parameters that the code accepts. You're going to want to have those in the comment-based help. And it can make it super useful for teaching people how to use your code. So always try to include that. All right, code complexity. This is where we talk about less lines, the better. So sometimes when you're doing a bunch of if-elses, you probably could have just done a switch, right? And if the switch is not one of the values, since you're checking for all the values either way, the default you could just error out or perform a different action. The spacing here I wouldn't necessarily agree with, but for trying to get everything on a slide big enough you could see it. But you could see the difference in the two styles. All right. Unit testing is probably a pain point for a lot of people. Can I get a show how many people actually do unit testing of their PowerShell code? So no one raised their hand, which is exactly what you kind of expect. But So unit testing is really just a way to validate that your code does what it says it's going to do. Additionally, you can put in information there about the parameters that are coming in or the values that are coming in, and it can be very complex. So I'm trying in here to do a very simple explanation. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that we have example code where I'm going to power on a VM. Actually, I'm just confirming the power state. So and I'm going to pass in a parameter here. So I get to pass in the VM as an option, and I get to pass in the power state that I expect the VM to be in. So in the code itself, I'm just saying with the VM object I have, get the power state. If it's equal to my power state, I'm going to return true, right? So from a pester perspective, which is the tool that we use in PowerShell, I'm going to define a fake VM, and then I convert it to JSON and then convert it back to a PowerShell object. It's easier for me to work with it that way, rather than creating a new PowerShell object that is a VM type. And then they have a specific syntax where it says, you basically write out in English what you want this test to do. So this one should return true if the power state matches the expected value or the desired value. So then you're going to call your function. And I say confirm power state. The VM is that fake object I created, and then it should be true. Now here I didn't specify a parameter, so that means that it's going to be powered off. So that's the default parameter that's set for the power state parameter. And we'll go into what success and fail looks like here in a second. So I'm going to jump back a second and say, why you should unit test your code. And these are all the different things. It's going to force you to write better code. So as you go through the testing process, you're going to find that you probably should have broken your test down into smaller pieces. Because when you have those nested ifs, you have to be able to flip the bit on those and provide a value to see whether or not you actually go in and execute that code, or whether you're going to go to the else. So as you write your pester code, you're going to be having this super long test, right? So I'd rather say, right, for a function, have a one action, one thing you're doing, and then you create another file for the next piece. It creates a lot of files, but it's easier to follow, it's easier to test. You'll like it eventually. You'll come around. So here's an example of running that pester test. So invoke pester, you give it the test function, and then you're going to give it the actual script you're running. I also threw in code coverage. Code coverage is basically telling you whether or not you've accounted for every line of code in your script. So in the case of this, in this test, I actually didn't cover all of my tests, right? My test passed, which is great, but I didn't cover all my lines. So on the next slide, we'll show you what I'm talking about. So this is the same code that I used before. So it's the same test. You see where the number 1 is kind of highlighted. That was that test that we ran. So I validated that if the power state matches the desired value, I'm going to return true. But what happens if it doesn't match? Right? I never actually tested for that. So the second test in the to section says that I'm going to return false if the power states do not match. So based on my fake object where the power state is off, I run the same command passing in the parameter that the power state should be powered on. They don't match, and I send the false back. So now I've tested all the lines in my code. Both tests passed, received the right values, and code coverage is 100%. Yay! All right. So we've talked briefly about pester already. We'll get back into it in a minute. You're also going to look at PS Script Analyzer. These are all modules you can install. And I recommend you just go ahead and do it. All right. So Script Analyzer, that's I would say this is more of the linting tool that you're going to use. This is going to be looking for all of those styling issues, or what someone that has come before us has determined you shall do PowerShell this way. And there's different rules. You can write your own custom rules. You can choose not to use any of the default custom rules that are set in. It's pretty simple to run. You're just going to basically specify either the path to the file, or you can do a path and save recurse and do all of the files in that directory. It's actually open source. It's out there on GitHub. It's not PowerShell code, so I don't really have a whole lot to add there. I do recommend you join their PowerShell Slack. There's a lot of really good information you can learn from there, a lot of questions that come in that might help you along your journey of getting better at writing code. As I said before, it has VS Code integration, so you'll see as soon as you start to write something, you just hang your mouse over the area that it is, and it tells you exactly what's wrong. So you can just fix it, move on with your life. When you run this and there is a finding, you can actually see, it'll tell you exactly what line that it came on. So this is a bad example because I actually ran it against a different script, but it'll tell you what line that the message was on, and you can go fix it. If you're paying close attention, the last thing that we found was global default server. So if you're a PowerCLI person, you know that in PowerCLI, that's actually a valid variable, but the PowerShell folks don't like global variables. So anytime that you were to include that in your script, you're going to get a PS script analyzer message. But there are ways to override it, and to do that, you would just take that message there that I have, and you can put this into the function file. So not the test file. You would actually want this right at the top of the function. PS script analyzer will ignore the rule that would apply to that piece. All right. What is that? That's cool. All right. Pester. We kind of went over this before. There's probably a lot of questions about this and a lot of questions about whether or not you should be 100% code coverage or whether you shouldn't. I'm going to say that that's probably like a personal thing for you, right? I always like to have the idea that I'm going to be 100% code coverage if I can, right? Because that way I know that my code's behaving as expected. Other people don't agree with that methodology, and they say whatever you can do is great. This is the same thing I went over before. I'm not going to go over it again. Definitely start small on that. All right. So one of the things I found probably pretty recently was a project called PS Code Health. And one of the nice things that it does, it actually wraps PS Script Analyzer and Pester together, and will run both of those for you. So you install one module, and you get all the benefits of both of those. There are some things you need to pay attention to the documentation on how you set up your test files. But it's pretty cool. If you don't know what this is, it's called splatting. It's a way to basically really make your parameterization easy when you call the script. There's a link to the docs. Read up on it. I haven't really found a good support for it, but it's good stuff. And the best part is that it gives you nice, beautiful results. So you can certainly go from the command line and get it, or you can spit stuff out to a nice HTML result. At work, I do a process which will use Jenkins to look at Subversion. As soon as I do a commit, it takes everything, it'll run my test. When it takes my test, it'll publish my test results, these web pages, out to a different results web server so I can view those. If the test passed, it'll publish to my internal gallery. So we'll take another look at that process in a minute. Back to Code Health. It does the same thing for you, right? So all those results that you were doing in the command line, it'll pull it right up here in the GUI and tell you what line it was that it found the error, what the error is. Unfortunately, there's nothing that's going to link you out to exactly what the fix is. So if it's some obscure error, you're going to have to Google around and find it. This is the complexity. It'll tell you what the nesting depth is. I have one that's 17, and it throws it up like a big red thing. It doesn't like that, but I write some weird stuff sometimes, so it's okay. So again, back to unit testing. It'll do a great summary of telling you how many tests you have, whether they pass, and what your code coverage is. So as those code coverage numbers start to go down, it'll start to go to a yellow and eventually a red. So there's settings in here that you can set for PS Code Health that'll adjust those numbers if you feel like you want to feel better about your code or things like that. All right, so that's all I have for these guys. All the code that was in there is on my GitHub repo, so you can see how I executed PS Code Health. You can see how I executed Script Analyzer and how I executed the Pester test, so you can kind of get a view. Earlier in the slideshow, there was a link to or a description that the best place that I've ever seen a Pester and unit testing described was in the PowerShell conference book by a guy named Mark Ragg. It was excellent read for understanding how to do it, why to do it, and the process in which you want to test your code. So I invite you to purchase the book and take a look at his chapter. So with that, I don't know, do we have time, whether I'm good, bad? So I can't hear you. Good, bad? Okay, so I have about a minute. If you have any questions, it's a lot, I know. All right, thank you to the VMware Code team. Thanks for everybody in attendance, appreciate it, thanks.